On the afternoon of May 20th, 1916, the factory manager of a whaling station on an island near Antarctica was relaxing in his home after a long day's work. Suddenly, there's a knock at the door. He answers, and standing before him are three men, covered in rags that barely resemble clothing, hair matted and well past their shoulders, beards unkempt, and faces black with filth. He stands there a moment in shock before asking, "Who the hell are you?" The man in the middle steps forward and replies, "I am Shackleton." The manager turns away and weeps. Standing before him is Ernest Shackleton, a boat captain who had been presumed dead for nearly 2 years. Hello, everyone. Today I will be telling the story of the HMS Endurance, her captain and her crew, and their fight for survival during their voyage into the Antarctic ice in the twilight days of the Age of Exploration. Before I do that, I just want to thank you all for watching. This is a story that means a lot to me. Ever since I first heard this story when I was 12 years old, had a fascination with sailing history, exploration. This story was a huge impact on that. So, if you want to hear one of the best stories of exploration and survival, as well as fantastic leadership in a dire situation, then let me introduce you to Ernest Shackleton, aka the Boss. Ernest Henry Shackleton was born February 15th, 1874, in Kilkea, Ireland, to parents Henry and Henrietta Shackleton. When Ernest was 6, his father would decide to go and study medicine at Trinity College in Dublin. He would then, after finishing his studies, move the family to London. It is in London, and at a very early age, that Ernest Shackleton falls in love with reading. He is consuming books constantly, and it's this love and affinity for reading that would actually build in him this desire to be an explorer. He was reading all these adventure books and stories of people going off and doing exploration, and he wanted to do the same. Unfortunately, he couldn't really get that when he was at school, so at the age of 16, he left. He had originally decided that he wanted to be a Royal Navy cadet, but at the time that he left school, he was already too old, so he took the next best option, an apprenticeship on a sailing vessel. After 4 years of working at this apprenticeship, he passes his exam to become a second mate. 2 years after that, he certifies as a master mariner. For the British meant he could take command of any British vessel anywhere in the world. Although at this point in his life, Shackleton has been steadily rising through the ranks, it isn't exactly what he wants. His very flamboyant and adventurous personality, this hunger for more, isn't really being satisfied, and he wants the adventure. He wants to go out there and explore. And he would get his first real taste of this in 1901 as a member of the Antarctic crew of the ship Discovery. The Discovery expedition was led by famed British explorer Robert F. Scott, and it lasts 3 years. Shackleton's brought on board as the third lieutenant of the expedition, which puts him in charge of the stores and provisions on board the ship, as well as conducting deep sea analysis. You see, the Discovery's mission and their kind of whole goal is to get further south than any other expedition had at this point, and maybe try to make for the South Pole if they're able to. However, they do run into a fair number of issues. The first of these being food. You see, they had a large group of dogs with them that they were going to be using to kind of pull stores and carry their gear across the ice as they continue to explore, but they ran into an issue with the dog food. It had either spoiled or become contaminated, so many of their dog teams were sick and not able to do what they needed them to do. Also, on the issue of food, Shackleton himself would actually start to suffer from scurvy, which, if you don't know, it's a disease. It really lowers your immune system. It causes aches and pains both in your muscles and in your joints. And in some severe cases, it can lead to convulsions, bleeding of the gums, and even death. And all of this is due to a lack of vitamin C, so eat your oranges, kids. Things actually get so bad for Shackleton that he becomes so weak that he's unable to fulfill his duties to the expedition, and Scott, the leader, has him declared an invalid. This basically means that there is an official document that says Shackleton was unable to complete his duties and is being relieved of whatever command that he has, and he ultimately gets sent home on a relief ship. There are conflicting stories about what this declaration actually did to the relationship between Shackleton and Scott. Some state that it actually wasn't that big a deal, and Shackleton actually respects him for doing what was best for the expedition. Some stating that Shackleton absolutely resented him, and that the reason Scott had even done this in the first place was to purposefully curb Shackleton's reputation, which had been growing steadily throughout the kind of sailing and exploration community, and Scott worried that it was going to outpace him and Shackleton would soon be more famous than him, so he did that in order to stop that from happening. Regardless of whether Shackleton resented Scott or not for sending him home, it certainly had an impact on him. Such an impact that it may have been one of the driving forces for his future expeditions. And another one of those driving forces likely came in 1904 when he marries Emily Dorman, the daughter of a wealthy British lawyer. By all accounts, they have a very, very good marriage, and their marriage puts a specific sort of desire and pressure on Shackleton, and that's the desire for wealth. Shackleton believes that it's his responsibility to take care of his family financially no matter what. This leads him to attempt multiple different business ventures, including manufacturing cigarettes, owning a taxi service, and attempting to transport Russian troops from the Far East. I don't really know what that means. I couldn't find much information on that. And when this fails, he finally starts making preparations for an additional Antarctic expedition in 1907. This next expedition, called the Nimrod Expedition, sets out with the explicit goal of reaching the South Pole. However, it's not to be. They take longer to get down south than they had originally anticipated, and after making it within 97 miles of the South Pole, the party is forced to turn around, and the return trip to the ship is a race against starvation. They're having to use half rations in order to supplement the lack of food that they have. And at one point, Shackleton even gives his ration for the day to his companion that is with him that is starting to weaken from the exertion. This selflessness is a defining trait of Shackleton's leadership and is part of what draws men to follow him in the first place. The expedition makes it home, and although he'd failed to reach his goal, not a single member of the crew was lost. He confides in his wife about not making it to the pole, and she says that the only thing he said in response to it was, "An alive donkey is better than a dead lion." Shackleton returns from the expedition basically a national hero. He becomes knighted by the king, he's made a naval commander, and he gets to travel around giving lectures and speeches about the Antarctic and their discoveries. And although these lectures pay him very well, he eventually finds himself falling back into trying these different business schemes, once again falling short. You see, publicly Shackleton is a very confident person. However, in private, it's a very different story. He is extremely anxious about providing for his family, and that's what leads him on to do all these kind of harebrained business ventures. And when they don't pan out, it just makes him more anxious. Eventually, he realizes that he's not very good at the domestic life, and with the support of his wife, he sets his sights once again on the Antarctic. It's now 1911. Colt has released the greatest sidearm of all time, and Shackleton wants to explore the Antarctic. Only problem, though, the British already have an expedition in the Antarctic. Robert Scott, Shackleton's old boss, is currently in a race with famed Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen to see who can reach the South Pole first. And Amundsen is the Michael Jordan of Arctic expedition. He is the first explorer to ever travel through the Northwest Passage. He is the first verified explorer to ever reach the North Pole, and now he's trying to make it to the South Pole. And the British, with their proud sailing heritage, do not want him to get the hat trick and reach the South Pole first. Unfortunately, that is exactly what happens. On December 14th, 1911, Amundsen and his team become the first humans to ever reach the South Pole. And even worse news, Scott and his team, although they do make it to the South Pole a month after Amundsen, none of them survive the return trip. This is devastating to the British. Not only did they fail to reach the South Pole first, but one of their best explorers died in the process. Fortunately for them, while Scott has been out there dying in the Antarctic, Shackleton's been at home planning another expedition, and he's not stupid. He uses the British people's desire for a win to his full advantage in order to secure funding for his next trip, even going so far as to write, and I quote, "I feel it is up to the British nation to accomplish this, for we have been beaten at the conquest of the North Pole and beaten at the first conquest of the South Pole. There now remains the largest and most striking of all journeys, the crossing of the continent." That's right, Ernest Shackleton, seeing that the there and back strategy not only didn't work, but also led to the death of one of their greatest explorers, says, "Hold my beer, I'm gonna cross the whole thing. Scott was going for free throws, I'm going for a full court shot." Some people criticize him for this, which he basically responds, "Well, you don't become the best by dreaming small, and besides, it works." Most of the funding for the expedition comes from the general public. The British people absolutely love this strategy, and they pour in thousands and thousands of dollars in donations. He also receives about £10,000 from the British government, as well as 3 generous donations from private benefactors named James Caird, Frank Dudley Docker, and Janet Stackholm Wills. He also prematurely sells all the rights to the photographic and videographic evidence that they plan on collecting during the trip. He also makes promises to write a book and go on more of the college lectures and tours like he did with his previous expedition. He does that to make up for the rest of the funding, and now he's got all the funding he needs. So Shackleton has an idea, he's got funding, and now he needs a plan, and for this, I need a map. Here's my map, which you should say nice things about. My wife drew it. Also, there's a sea monster. His name is Fred. So, Shackleton's plan is to take his ship and sail into this region known as the Weddell Sea. They will then sail through it south to the actual Antarctic continent. Once there, they will get out what is called a sledging party, which is basically just sleds hauling their gear and pulled by dogs. They are going to make their way south towards the South Pole. In the meantime, another ship has gone around to the other side of the continent into what is called the Ross Sea. They set up a little base on that side of the sea, and then they're supposed to work their way towards the South Pole and leave ration crates for the sledging party to eventually use after they've crossed past the South Pole. Once the sledging party has reached their base, they've effectively crossed the continent and reached their goal. They'll then take that additional ship out of the Ross Sea back to England, having completed their mission. Shackleton, now with funding and a plan that he believes is foolproof, needs some ships. And the first ship that he acquires is called the Aurora. It's a sailing vessel that already had 2 previous Antarctic expeditions under its belt. And this is the ship that's going to carry the Ross party onto the other side of the continent. As for his ship, the one that will sail into the Weddell Sea and carry the main voyage, he needs something special, and something special is exactly what he gets. He approaches a Norwegian whaler by the name of Lars Christensen, who had previously commissioned a boat to be built. However, his financial partner had run into some trouble with money, so he had to back out, and this forces Christensen to sell. So Shackleton goes and takes a look, and he discovers that this ship was an absolute labor of love, and that the shipyard that built her treated her like a pet project. Every single piece of wood that is used to build this ship is specifically selected to make it the strongest ship possible. Keel, or the bottom of the boat, was built out of solid oak and is 7 feet thick. The sides of the ship have a special type of wood on them to make them extra strong. And the bow of the ship, which will hit the ice directly, is over 4 feet thick. Every timber in the ship is specifically selected and fits perfectly. Every joint and fitting is cross-braced for extra strength. The yard that had originally built her gave an estimate in 1959 that a ship of that build and quality would cost north of $1 million. Shackleton, being extremely lucky as he is, gets her at quite the discount and only pays $67,000. The ship is originally named Polaris, but Shackleton decides to rename her, taking inspiration from his family motto, "By endurance we conquer," and thus, the Endurance is born. One problem with having a ton of money in a ship, you need a crew to man that ship, and Shackleton goes about selecting his crew in a way only he could. First on the list and second in command is Frank Wild. Wild was a member of the previous Nimrod expedition, and if you remember, the crew member that I said Shackleton gave his rations to on the return trip to the ship, that was Frank Wild. He is described as being incredibly tough, quiet, and somewhat unimaginative, but this actually works very well in contrast to Shackleton's kind of whimsical personality, and the two of them form an extremely well-balanced team. Next in line, we have Thomas Crean, an Irishman who, like Shackleton, left home at 16 in order to sail, only he spent all his time in the Royal Navy, making him extremely well-disciplined and damn near bulletproof. He was a former member of the Discovery and the Terra Nova expedition with Scott, the Terra Nova being the expedition that ended up taking Scott's life. Crean really could have his own video, but all you need to know is that during the Terra Nova expedition, the dude was playing hopscotch on pieces of floating ice in order to make it back to his camp. He is incredibly tough and extremely valuable to this mission's success. Rounding out our experienced crew, we have Alfred Sheatham as third officer with 3 previous Antarctic expeditions under his belt, George Marston, the expedition's artist, and Thomas McLeod, a previous member of the Nimrod expedition. We have our veterans. Time to round out the rest of the crew. How do we do that? Well, Shackleton has an idea. Being the flamboyant personality that he is, and already having the British people hyped for this expedition, he decides to publish an ad in the newspaper looking for crew members. And that ad reads, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in the event of success." And I know what you're probably thinking. That sounds awful, and I bet he didn't get any applicants. First off, I could call 5 of my friends right now and ask if they wanted to sail on a ship into God knows where and potentially die, and they would be on board immediately. So, not only are you wrong by modern standards, but also by 1914 standards, because Shackleton receives over 5,000 applicants. Shackleton himself conducts the interviews of all of these applicants, none of the interviews lasting more than 5 minutes, and what if 5 minutes they were? You would think that the nature of this mission would mean that the interview process is going to be extremely rigorous and only the best men with the best qualifications are going to get in and they're going to have to pass all these back. No, Shackleton doesn't roll that way. He basically selects his crew on a whim. Rather than focusing on experience or qualification, he chooses them based on intuition and how well he thinks they'll work as a team. One of the surgeons, Alexander Macklin, is chosen after an exchange where Shackleton asked him why he was wearing glasses and he responded, "Many a wise face would look foolish without spectacles, sir." This sort of banter is something that goes a really long way with making impressions on Shackleton and really endearing his crew to him. We will see that again later on, but I'll get to that. The seemingly lighthearted approach to selecting his crew actually points to another characteristic of his leadership style. Shackleton wants to be close to his men, and this candor that he displays during interviews was all a part of building that right out of the gate. He had also learned from his previous years at sea that the best leaders were the ones who were willing to suffer the same hardship and working conditions as the men under them. As Shackleton is conducting his interviews and filling out the rest of the roster and preparing all the equipment for the expedition, he meets Frank Worsley, aka Wuzzles. Frank Worsley is from New Zealand and has been at sea since he was 16, and he's now 42. He's described as always having this mischievous expression and having a very wild imagination, and according to him, the way that he became the part of the expedition went like this. One night, he was laying in bed, and he has a dream. The dream is that he is on Burlington Street in London, and it is covered in floating blocks of ice, and he is navigating a ship through it. The next day, he goes down to Burlington Street, and he sees a sign, Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. He goes inside and meets Shackleton, who is immediately drawn to him, so much so that he doesn't even have to express that he wants to join, and he is hired on the spot as the ship's captain. The rest of the crew is assembled, and pretty soon the expedition is ready to set sail, manned by Shackleton and 26 other members. Unfortunately, this is where history steps in and prevents a really good story from being remembered. You see, on June 28th, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and the British, with the looming threat of war, they don't see the expedition off with the excitement that it really deserves. On August 4th, 1914, as Shackleton is presented the Union Jack, the flag that the expedition is going to be flying, Britain declares war on Germany, signaling their entry into World War I. Shackleton actually offers the service of the ship and the crew to the Royal Navy, and after sending a message asking the Admiralty if they should stay or go, they received a one-word reply: proceed. The ship sets sail for Buenos Aires, where they're to pick up other crew members and a bunch of supplies, and it's at this point that it's discovered that maybe selecting off of a whim was not the best idea. Over half of this crew becomes seasick on the way down, and even the first officer, Lionel Greenstreet, who at this point in time is a very experienced sailor, says that the ship behaved in a most abominable way. All these factors would become apparent to Shackleton once he arrived in Buenos Aires. He had to stay behind and take care of some more administrative stuff, so when he gets there, he finds a seasick crew, but he also discovers that Frank Worsley is not a disciplinarian, and at this point, morale is at an all-time low, so much so that the cook that was originally hired would show up to work absolutely hammered and basically refused to put any effort into cooking. So he's let go, and a new member by the name of Charles Green is brought in, and he is so dedicated to being a cook, he's almost a savant. Also arriving in Buenos Aires, a man hired solely for his skills and who I believe to be absolutely insane, James Francis, aka Frank Hurley, the expedition's photographer. This man is the definition of dedicated, and the idea that he is dedicated to is pics or it didn't happen. This man is climbing into the rigging of this ship with a 20-pound camera to take pictures and video. And the pictures and video that he collects are later considered some of the best from this time period of exploration. I like to think that Shackleton knew that would be the case, and that's exactly why he hired him. Also coming on board are the final members of the crew, 69 sled dogs. After everything is loaded up, at 10:30 a.m. on October 26th, the ship sets sail for South Georgia Island, a small island off the southern coast of South America where they will have their last port of call before heading into the Weddell Sea. From Buenos Aires is relatively uneventful, except for one thing. 3 days after they leave, a stowaway named Percy Blackborough is discovered, and Shackleton is pissed. He stands in front of the entire crew and berates Percy and the people who helped him stow away. But remember how I said that Shackleton likes a good bit of banter? In the middle of his tirade, he yells, "You know, on these expeditions, we get hungry, and if there are any stowaways available, they are the ones that get eaten first. Well, sir, they'd get a lot more meat off of you." Shackleton tries to hide his smirk and tells Percy that he'll be working for the cook, and he is quickly accepted as a member of the crew. Several days later, on November 5th, they would arrive at the Grytviken whaling station on South Georgia Island, and when they get there, they are met with some bad news. The sailors at the station advise Shackleton that the conditions of the ice are worse than they have ever seen in their 40-plus years sailing in this region, and many of the captains try to convince Shackleton to wait until the following year. Although Shackleton does not want to wait that long, he does agree that some rest and waiting for the conditions to improve would do some good. So what do you do while you're waiting for the weather to change in the most remote part of the planet? You party. The crew of the Endurance holds several parties on board their ship, and the whalers kind of return the favor and host some parties on shore. While the crews are hosting their parties, however, Shackleton is learning. He actually goes over to another whaling station on the island called Stromness, and he sits with the station manager, Thorolf Sorol, and learns everything he can about the Weddell Sea. What he learns is that the Weddell Sea might be unlike any other sea in the entire world. For one, its shape. It basically is the shape of a bowl with a lid on it. You have this area here, which is known as the Palmer Peninsula, which juts out from the Antarctic continent, kind of like the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. You have the actual Antarctic continent, which continues kind of north from here, creating kind of that bowl shape. And then you have South Georgia and what's known as the South Sandwich Islands, which trail off in this direction as well. They kind of act as the lid. What this does is creates a place where ice cannot easily escape. Ice that forms in the Weddell Sea can be there for decades. In fact, we have a really modern example of this. The largest known iceberg in the world broke off of the Antarctic continent into the Weddell Sea in 1986. Just a few weeks ago, it finally made it to South Georgia, meaning it spent over 4 decades, or almost 4 decades, trapped inside the Weddell Sea. Another factor that makes sailing into this region very difficult is the wind. Compared to most Antarctic standards, the wind in the Weddell Sea is fairly mild. Because it is moderate compared to Antarctic standards, it means that the ice within it does not move as much as you would kind of expect when it's broken up and loose. And what that means is it's not moving, and therefore ice can form here at any point in the year, which makes it extremely difficult to know when to sail into. The third and final factor that makes sailing into this region so difficult is the current. Ocean currents throughout the world, at least from the surface, don't seem to move with any rhyme or reason, and the Weddell Sea is no exception. What happens here is something that's scientifically known as Weddell gyre, or in layman's terms, all of the water here is moving in a clockwise circle constantly. And what that does when you fill this region with ice, it causes all the ice to press against the Palmer Peninsula here. And when that happens, it creates an immense amount of pressure. As you can imagine, sailing into conditions like this is not going to be easy, and Shackleton knows it. So he spends as much time as he can learning from Sorel and discovering what this sea is like. And he ultimately comes up with a plan to try and skirt the eastern side of the sea, and hopefully he can skirt past all the ice to their target at Vassal Bay. If he's able to do this, it would be able to get him down to Vassal Bay, land the ship, land the party, and continue on to phase 2 of their mission. Plan is set, and they decide to wait until December 5th to take off because they're waiting on a supply ship that has their last letters coming from home. That ship never arrives, so at 8:45 a.m. on December 5th, the Endurance hoists anchor and heads out towards the Weddell Sea. 2 hours later, the supply ship arrives with their letters. They head south, and within 2 days, they pass Saunders Island in the South Sandwich Group. As they pass by the island and continue south, they see their mortal enemy, ice. At this point, it's a pretty small, loosely packed patch of ice that they can easily sail around, but it's a sign of things to come, and they know it. They continue to sail on for several days and a couple weeks, and at this point, they should be making about 200 miles a day in open water. Right now, they are crawling at only 30 miles a day in loosely packed ice, meaning that their original plan to reach Vassal Bay by Christmas is off by an extremely wide margin, and by the time Christmas Eve rolls around, they haven't even made it into the Antarctic Circle. Right around New Year's Eve, however, there is a bit of a change in the ice. Up until this point, they've run into really dense, old ice that's very difficult to sail through or break, but now they're starting to see newer and newer ice, which is brittle and breaks easy. It's much easier to sail through. And on January 9th, they pass an iceberg that reaches 150 feet into the air, much taller than their ship, and they estimate over 1,000 feet below the surface. This would be the last ice that they see, as they are now back in open water. They continue to sail south until they are now within 200 miles of their goal, but on January 24th, the ice closes in. They are now surrounded by ice as far as they can see in every direction. It's over 2 weeks before any chance of escape finally opens up, but that's exactly what happens on February 14th. Early in the morning, a quarter mile ahead, they see open water. The crews rush out onto the ice with saws, hoping to cut a channel into the ice. They even cut a V shape in the ice, hoping that they can fit the bow in and ram it and break the flow of ice that they're trapped in, similar to how modern icebreakers do it today. Finally, after several grueling days of effort, they've only made it 600 yards, and the effort is called off. They're now within 400 yards of the open water, but it's impassable. The ice at this point is 12 to 18 feet thick, and there's no way to get through it. Finally, on February 24th, 1915, Shackleton makes the announcement that most of the men already know is coming. It just hasn't been made official. They're trapped. They're going to have to spend the winter on board the ship. This is obviously not great news to the crew, but what is even more discouraging is they find out that they have actually drifted to within 60 miles of Vassal Bay. You might be thinking, okay, 60 miles doesn't seem like that long, especially to add to their 1,800-mile trek that they have to make. Why don't they just continue on foot? You know what? Fair enough. But there's several factors that you have to realize about this. Number one, they're on a floating pack of ice that may or may not be connected to the continent. They could get 30 miles into their trip on foot and run into open water again, and without a ship, they're screwed. Number two, they have a ton of gear that they already would have to take with them for the trek. That includes their rations for a year and timber to build some kind of outpost or shelter for them so that they don't succumb to the elements. And number three, and maybe most important, is the dogs that they have for the trek are not trained at this point. They're not in shape. They can't make that sort of trek at this point. There was always a plan to train the dogs, but now they have to do it on the floating ice. So their only option that they really have is to hunker down and wait for the ice to melt. This is absolutely not what Shackleton wants. For the expedition to be so soon into the trip and already having to stop is absolutely devastating for him. But true to his form of leadership, he refuses to let the men see this side of him, and he remains cheerful while supervising all the work and preparations that they have to do. Those preparations include things like changing the quarters of the men into lower parts of the ship where it's warmer and they have a stove, and building these little shelters on the ice for the dogs that they affectionately call dogloos, which, like look at that. It's adorable. Like, look at this puppy here. He's the only one that's actually happy that they're stuck on the ice. Because they're going to have to stay on the ship for the winter, the supplies that they brought with them are not enough. Remember, these rations were specifically for crossing the continent, not spending the winter on the ice. So they have to bring in game, which is fairly easy in February. They see as much as 200 seals a day, and the glacier that they're trapped in is covered in penguins. So bringing in game is really pretty easy, up until about March. March is when the penguins and the seals start migrating north, so they become scarcer and scarcer to find. And because of this, Frank, Wuzzles, Worley, and Frank Wild become kind of the hunting experts. This was due to Worsley having really good eyesight and Wild having really good marksmanship. This all continues for several months, and by April 10th, they have nearly 5,000 pounds of meat and blubber stored up. After nearly 4 months on the ice, in early May, they take a reading to determine what the position of the ship is, and what they discover is less than ideal. They discover that they have been drifting nearly 130 miles northwest while trapped in the ice, meaning that they are now caught in the Weddell Gyre that I talked about earlier. This news is not great, but it's accompanied by a more ominous sign, as in the early days of May, they see the sun go down behind the horizon for the last time and are plunged into what is known as the polar night. Quick context for the polar night. There are a ton of studies and research that has come out about the human body and its need for sunlight. Many people around the world, especially in the more northern and southern parts of the world, suffer from what is known as seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, which, haha, very funny whoever named it. This is a state where the body is more susceptible to depression, anxiety, transmittable diseases, and infections, all due to a lack of vitamin D. Some of these symptoms can be very extreme and even lead to more life-threatening issues within the body, and that's just when it's super cloudy or the sun is out for fewer hours a day. Now imagine that it's completely dark for months at a time. What effect that would have on your health? Lucky for you, we don't have to imagine what it's like because we have a perfect example of what can happen. Remember the man who I said had originally been a partner in the construction of the Endurance but had to back out due to financial trouble? It turns out that he had actually been trapped in the Antarctic ice once before. He was a member of a ship called the Belgica, which became trapped in the ice in 1898, and during the polar night that followed, the men on board became almost possessed by this kind of sadness. Many of the men struggled to work or even eat, and some of them took to walking around the ship in a circle for hours on end. One man became so scared of the dark that he developed a heart condition and died. Another man became so paranoid that everyone else on the ship was trying to kill him that he squeezed himself between timbers on the ship in order to sleep. Finally, one man announced that he was tired and he was going to walk back to Belgium. Not sure how he's going to make it. These are the exact conditions that Shackleton and his crew are now trapped in. So what kinds of strange sadness and paranoia await them? Well, none really. Yeah, there really isn't anything that they run into. The crew of the ship had actually become very close with one another, and in spite of their various backgrounds that they came from, didn't really have any negative feelings towards one another. Even Percy Blackborough, the previous stowaway that I had mentioned, had become a welcomed part of the crew in working with the cook, Charles Green. His cheerful demeanor actually helped keep spirits high. The crew had also learned a lot of the little intricacies of one another, and at this point, they spent a good amount of time joking with one another. On several occasions, actually, Green and Blackborough took the opportunity when a crewmate had a birthday to play pranks on them by creating fake birthday cakes. One thing that could really be found amongst all of the crew members that really helped them get through the polar night was a good sense of humor. The only member of the crew that doesn't really have a sense of humor was George Marston, the ship's artist. He was actually extraordinarily anxious and always worried about the future, and unlike the rest of the crew, he was not optimistic that they were going to get out of the ice. And he's somebody that Shackleton decides to keep a pretty close eye on because he worries that Marston's kind of attitude is going to infect the rest of the crew. Other than his attitude, there really isn't any issues during their long night. The only sign of any kind of madness actually occurred one evening where Marston and Wilde decided to cut their hair. Pretty soon that spread to the rest of the ship where everyone, including the boss, had a completely shaved head. And the pranks and the joking continued until on Midwinter's Day, June 22nd, they have a party. And boy, did they go all out for this party. Everyone's drinking their grog, they're wearing costumes, some of them were dressed like women, the others, well, dressed like that, and Orderly's the storekeeper even dresses as a minister. And they spend the night singing songs and reciting poetry and acting out scenes from plays that they know, and at the end of the night, they all sing God Save the King. And as they all turned in, they're ecstatic because winter's halfway over. As time goes on, the weather continues to change. There's a blizzard that lasts for several days, and the wind is just howling constantly. Pretty soon, they go outside the ship to discover what is known as pressure ridges. Pressure ridges are giant stacks of ice that form the same way we were taught mountains form, right? With two pieces of ice pressing against one another until finally they buckle and shoot upwards. This creates these ridges, a sign that the flow is no longer solid and the ice is beginning to break apart. What this also does is it creates a sort of ice sail. Think about it this way. When the ice is flat, the wind can just blow over it and it doesn't really affect how the ice moves. If it has a pressure ridge, the wind catches it, pushing it away. And what this does is create a sort of feedback loop where the ice gets pushed into itself, it creates more pressure ridges, which are more areas for the ice to catch the wind, which just creates more pressure. Again, it's just this feedback loop of pressure, and that pressure would eventually come to visit the ship on August 1st, 1915. At 10 a.m., the men are out, they're doing their work, and then suddenly they hear this terrible grinding sound. Suddenly, the ship jolts upward as a piece of ice slams into her side, and everyone stares and watches. Then, just as soon as she'd been thrust up, She drops back down into the water. Shackleton orders the crew onto the ice to get all the dogs inside, and just as they do, the piece of ice that the dogloos were on smashes into the ship, destroying all the dogloos in a matter of minutes. On the bow side of the ship, the floe is just breaking into smaller pieces, and they're pressing harder and harder against the ship, and she's making these groaning sounds. And this goes on for 15 minutes, but the ship doesn't give in, and finally, things start to calm down, and the pressure stops. By the time it's all over, the ship is back on top of the ice, but she's slightly tilted or listing to one side. So the ship has survived her first bout of pressure, and this, paired with the return of the sun, really boosts the men's confidence. Another factor that does so is they take a reading and discover that they have now drifted 160 miles back south. However, Shackleton is not so confident, and he tries to temper everyone's expectations by telling this story about a mouse that drinks a pint of beer and suddenly thinks it can fight a cat. It seems that Shackleton is the only one who realizes that this isn't going to be their last bout of pressure. Over the course of the rest of August and into September, small little bouts of pressure continue to press upon the ship, but every time she fights them back. And finally, in the early days of October, signs that the ice might open up start to appear. The temperature is now a balming 10 degrees above zero, and the biologist Bobby Clark has started to find plankton in the water. Along with the plankton is other signs of sea life start to emerge, which means that the water is getting warmer and the ice may eventually melt and break up. These signs are very promising, and that promise seems to be kept, as by October 14th, the ship is actually sitting in a puddle of water. But as we know, sometimes promises go unkept, and this is no exception. On October 21st, the hardest pressure to date arrives, and it arrives with a vengeance. They feel a large, sluggish shockwave of pressure tremble through the ice, and the crew can hear it long before it reaches the ship. One member describes it as this phenomenal beast of nature, too big to comprehend. And then, with no effort whatsoever, the ship gets pinned between two floes of ice. One of these floes partially tears the stern post away from the boat, and immediately water starts gushing into the hold and into the engine room. The crew immediately goes to work. Some of them are using a portable pump to get water out, others start up the engine room bilge pumps, and hand pumps are started up as well, but after several minutes of hard work, they realize no water is coming out. The pumps are frozen. No big deal, we'll just go unfreeze the pumps. So Captain Worsley takes two other men into the belly of the ship to try and fix the problem. Working in basically pitch black and bitter cold, they start trying to get the blockage out. They do everything from pouring buckets of boiling water onto the pumps to, at one point, somebody takes a blowtorch and starts running it along the pipes while another person slams it with a hammer. Finally, after over an hour of work, the pumps break free and they are able to start pumping water out, but they realize they aren't going to be able to operate the pumps forever. So, carpenter Harry McNeish gets to work building a cofferdam to stop the incoming water. If you don't know what a cofferdam is, it's those structures you see in like bridge building videos where they kind of build this structure in a circle and then pump all the water out. He builds one of these a little bit forward from where the leak is in the boat so that it keeps the ship from flooding any further. This takes him over 28 hours to complete, and even then they have to keep the pumps running because there's just so much water that's already leaked inside the ship. While many of the crew members are inside and working the pumps, those who are in charge of the dog teams are preparing sleds in the unlikely event that things get worse. At 9 p.m., things get worse. The pressure increases to the point that the entire ship makes what is described as animal-like screams. At this point, Shackleton orders that all essential gear be moved out onto the ice, and that work continues late into the night until something very strange happens. A group of 10 emperor penguins waddles extremely close to the ship, closer than they ever have before, and at one point they suddenly raise all their heads and let out what the men describe as a mournful dirge. It's almost like the penguins know something that the men haven't quite come to terms with. Throughout the rest of the night and into the next morning, the work continues and progress is almost non-existent. And at 4 p.m. on October 27th, the pressure ramps up again, and this time there's no fighting back. The pressure buckles the decks and breaks the beams. The stern post that was already damaged is ripped completely off, and the rear of the ship is thrust 20 feet in the air. And at 5 p.m., Frank Wild is going around and he's talking to the crew. He finds two men who are sleeping, waiting for their turn at the pumps, and he sticks his head inside their little room and says, "She's going, boys. I think it's time to get off." Exhausted from hours and hours of futile work trying to save the ship, the men go straight to work setting up some sort of camp. The little collection of tents and stores eventually comes to be known as Ocean Camp. The men try their best to create some level of comfort so they can get some sleep, but Shackleton gets no sleep. He just paces back and forth along the ice, back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth. At 1 a.m., the ice cracks, and he goes from tent to tent, waking everyone up and making sure that they move camp. And after an hour of work, yet again, they finally get to turn in for some sleep. The next morning is filled with terrible sounds of the Endurance cracking and breaking apart, and Shackleton wastes no time, and he creates a new plan. The plan is to take a bunch of their rations, sleds pulled by dogs, and 2 of the boats with them, and walk towards Paulet Island, just 346 miles away. And this would be quite the task if they were just walking on a flat surface, but they're not. They have all the pressure ridges to deal with, and some of them are massive. Pair this with the fact that the boats each weigh about 2,000 pounds. Nobody believes that this is going to be easy. However, they're all very happy. They now finally have a goal. Is it potentially life-threatening? Yeah, but whatever. They've been trapped in their boat for over 9 months with almost nothing to do. Now they have something to motivate them, and they're ready to go. The good spirits of the men may also be due to the fact that so many of them were inexperienced with the Arctic. They don't really understand exactly what it is that it takes to survive in this place. It's a sort of ignorance is bliss kind of thing. You also have to remember that a lot of these people hadn't even been to sea before this trip, so they might also be just looking at this as just one big adventure. And before that adventure can start, we gotta get all this crap out of the ship. The crew takes several trips back to the broken ship over the course of the next few weeks. They use these trips to recover as much from the ship as they can. Everything from food to personal items and film from the cameras. In the end, they recover over 4.5 tons of food. And after retrieving all that they could, they raise the flag on the last remaining pole that they can find, and they fire a signal flare, kind of a final salute to the ship. And finally, on November 21st, just before 5 p.m., the back of the ship raises up into the air for one last time and sinks silently below the water. The men watch this from whatever raised positions they can find, and there's a sort of almost funeral-esque atmosphere. This ship has been their home, their shelter at the end of the world, and now it's gone for good. Shackleton orders a special meal that night as a way to commemorate the loss of their ship, a sort of almost a funeral wake, if you will. While everybody enjoys it, Shackleton is extremely anxious at this point. He can't shake his thoughts and anxieties. He just constantly is thinking about the responsibility he has to these men, a responsibility he already feels that he's failed. He is extremely anxious about the possibility of having to spend another winter here, only this time it'll be on the ice. No ship to keep them warm or safe, only tents and sleeping bags. Shackleton's anxiety is also not helped by attitudes of certain members of the crew. The first member of concern is Frank Hurley. Remember how I said he's a phenomenal photographer? Well, he's also somebody who has to be reminded of that fact quite often, otherwise he gets very disheartened. Another member of the crew that Shackleton worries about is Harry McNeish, the carpenter. At this point is quite homesick, and he's a bit of a hard ass for the rules of seamanship. The third member of concern is Thomas Orderlies, the storekeeper, who is lazy in pretty much everything he does except for storekeeping. Shackleton is concerned that all 3 of these members' negative attitudes could spread to the rest of the crew, so he places Frank Wild in charge of watching them. The next several weeks, life just kind of continues on the ice. They're building up the camp, and McNeish and several of the other crew members start working on the remaining boats. They add some fortifications from lumber that they retrieve from the Endurance. They build up the sides of the boats so that not only is it more difficult for water and waves from the ocean to get poured into the boats, but it also makes it to where they can store more men and provisions in the boats without them sitting too low in the water. Once the construction is finished on the boats, they have to name them. Shackleton decides to name them after their 3 private benefactors that donated so much to the expedition. The last 3 seagoing vessels that they have are named the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. Now that the boats are ready, it's time to pack everything for the journey, and Shackleton is convinced that speed is going to be their ally over preparedness. So he sets an extremely strict limit on what the men are allowed to take. Each man is allowed the clothes on his back, 2 pairs of mittens, 6 pairs of socks, 2 pairs of boots, and a sleeping bag, as well as 1 pound of tobacco and 2 pounds of personal items. This may not seem like a lot now, what with all the ultra-light gear that we have in 2025, but back then, this was a brutal restriction. How he expected them to survive with only a pound of tobacco, I have no idea. Being ever the leader and not willing to have better treatment than his men, immediately after giving the order, Shackleton takes a gold cigarette case and several gold coins out of his pocket and throws them in the snow. He then takes the expedition Bible, the last thing he grabbed when they abandoned ship, and he rips out the flyleaf, which had a message from Queen Alexandra, the 23rd Psalm, and Job 38 out of the Bible. He then sets it in the snow and walks away without saying a word. Before we move on, I wanted to address what I think the reasoning behind him taking these two Bible verses is. Of course, he's trying to stick with the weight restrictions that he's placed on everybody, so much so to the point that even the Bible might have some unnecessary weight, but he's not leaving it completely. And the two that he takes, Psalm 23 and Job 38, seem to make sense to me with his character and the point of this expedition. For those of you who don't know, Psalm 23 is maybe one of the most famous verses in the entire Bible, or at least it contains one of the most famous verses, but it's relatively short, so I'm just going to read the whole thing. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord. To me, nothing really sounds quite like the Valley of the Shadow of Death, quite like the Antarctic. And remember, he's taking this right after losing their ship. And I think he takes this because maybe he recognizes that it's not the ship that keeps him safe. It's not the ship that allows them to survive, but their creator. The other verse that he takes, Job 38, is a little bit less well known. The story of Job is about a man who is very well blessed. He has been given lots of things by God in his earthly life. The story takes place where Satan actually tells God that the only reason that Job loves him is because he's given him all these things, so he asks that God let him take those things, and he does. The story eventually gets to where Job is so worn down and beaten, his land is completely desolate, he himself is covered with sores and is aching physically, and all of his friends have come to him and basically berated him, telling him that there must be something wrong with him, he must have done something to deserve this. And Job 38 takes place right after he yells at and basically condemns God, and Job 38 is the start of God's response. And he asks Job a series of rhetorical questions about where was Job during the creation of the world? Was it Job who laid the foundations of the entire world? Is it him who controls all of these different things? The obvious answer is no, but there's a specific verse in here that I wanted to highlight that I think might be the reason that Shackleton grabbed it. Who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm, to water a land where no man lives, a desert with no one in it, to satisfy the desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass? Does the rain have a father? Whose father are the drops of dew? From whose womb comes the ice? Who gives birth to the frost from heavens, when the waters become hard as stone, when the surface of the deep is frozen? I think that Shackleton probably took this verse as a bit of a reminder of how small he is in all of this, and that the expedition that they were going on, the goal that they had, was a monumental one to them, but to God, it was nothing. God was the one who created all of these things. It was his power that set all of this in place. I think that Shackleton took this as a reminder of the situation that they were in and how difficult this was, but also that the person who created these things was on his side, was somebody that he believed in and that he followed, and that his faith would hopefully pull them through and they would be able to persevere, having these words of wisdom and these words from God with them as not just a motivation, but also a comfort. I don't know, I just like to think that that's why he took those with him. Everyone around him, seeing what a badass their leader is, quickly follows suit, and pretty soon there is a massive pile of belongings piled up on the ice where Shackleton had left the Bible. And at one point, Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist for the expedition, went to put his banjo on the pile, and Shackleton ordered him to keep it for morale reasons. Again, this whole situation just shows what an excellent leader he is, and one of the best things that makes him an excellent leader, leading by example. Now that everything's packed up, we can finally get on the road, right? Wrong. The entire crew is going to sit at Ocean Camp for another month. The reason for this was they had started to see warmer temperatures and were hoping that the ice would eventually break up, but nothing had come of it. Eventually, they finally set the date that early on December 23rd, they're going to be leaving, which means they're going to be on the road during Christmas, so they're going to have to celebrate early. And what they decide to do is to have a giant meal and allow every man to eat however much he wants. This was done in part because they had recovered enough stores that they actually couldn't take all of it with them, and they were going to have to leave some, so they might as well eat it. This was also due to the fact that Shackleton knew that the journey ahead of them was going to be long and hard, and he wanted to give them as many calories as he could to give them the energy boost that they needed to start this trip off. The next morning after the meal, December 23rd at 3 a.m., they set off. Shackleton decided that it would be better for them to travel at night because it made the ice more solid, because at this point the temperatures have raised so much that there's a thin layer of water on top of the ice sheets that they're on. Unfortunately, this makes it extremely uncomfortable and wet when they're sleeping and they pitch their tents. They had set up a solution for this at Ocean Camp, but they had to leave that behind in order to meet the weight requirements. The other thing that they end up leaving behind is the third boat, the Stancomb Wills, because Shackleton believes that speed is going to be needed and this is only going to slow them down. With the Stancomb Wills, Shackleton also leaves a note. It basically says that the Endurance was crushed at these coordinates and sank, and that the crew had decided to get out and walk west. It was signed all well and left there by Worsley after they had already left. Shackleton worried that if the men saw him leaving a note, it would show them that maybe their leader doesn't believe that they can make it out of this, and it would only make things worse for the crew, and he absolutely does not want any discontent growing, because if it does, he's pretty sure they'll die. Speaking of discontent, after an evening of pulling the sleds and working west, McNeish the carpenter just stops. He refuses to go on even after Worsley gives him a direct order to resume his work. And it may be the funniest part of the whole story because it plays out like a court case on ice. McNeish asserts that according to maritime law, because the ship went down, the articles he signed to join the crew are now null and void. This meant that in his eyes, he had no reason to follow any order and could basically do what he wanted. Shackleton comes in like, counter? You're in the middle of nowhere on a frozen sea, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from civilization, and I'm your only hope of getting back, so you should just do what I say. Shackleton also comes with receipts reminding McNeish that the paperwork he signed also stated that he was to, quote, perform any duty on board, in the boats, or on shore as directed by the master and owner. And by Shackleton's definition, they are now on shore. McNeish calms down, he goes off and grumbles to himself for a little bit so he can chill out. Then Shackleton gathers the rest of the crew around and proceeds to read the entirety of the articles they signed just to prove a point and make sure everybody knows that's not an excuse that's gonna work. After making some decent headway west, the crew runs into a pretty big problem. At this point, the temperatures were rising pretty rapidly, which meant that the ice they were walking on was also melting rapidly. This meant that even though they were walking on ice, the ice had a several inch layer of water on top of it, which not only made it extremely difficult to walk through, but it got everything wet. This also means that the ice is dangerously thin, so Shackleton orders that they retreat and move on to a sturdier section of ice and set up what they will call Mark Time Camp on New Year's Eve. And Mark Time is exactly what they do. They sit at this camp and wait, and wait, and wait, and wait. While waiting at this camp, a group of men are actually sent back to the original camp in order to retrieve the Stancomb Wills. Shackleton decided that with the temperature changing so rapidly, the ice would eventually break up soon and they would have to launch the boats, and having a third boat would be a good idea. Plus, they were close enough to camp that they could go get it. After bringing up the Stancomb Wills, days go by, and the days turn into weeks, and the weeks turn into months. Months of just sitting and waiting. And pretty soon it's now March, and although they've brought in close to 600 penguins, the food situation is becoming an issue. On March 16th, they run out of tea, flour, and coffee. Their rations continue to dwindle, and so is any hope that they're actually going to escape. Then, on March 23rd, Shackleton decides to go for a stroll, and he's just walking around on the floe, walking around looking for something. He's hoping that he can find open water or, God willing, land, and he's walking, and he's walking, and he's going in circles, and he's about to lose hope when suddenly he sees it. 42 miles away, he sees a small island off the Palmer Peninsula called Danger Island, which means that their destination of Pollitt Island is only 62 miles away. That evening, Shackleton writes in his diary, "Please God, we will soon get ashore." A few days later, on March 29th, the floe, which had become their new home, cracked. In the middle of the night, Third Officer Alfred Sheatham is on watch when the floe suddenly cracks all the way across in 2 places. He runs around camp, waking everyone from their tents when another massive crack appears right under the James Caird. Immediately, men start jumping across. They grab ropes and pull the James Caird across the crack. While this is going on, other men are jumping across and throwing food across the camp, just doing everything that they can to get the camp to a safe location. And after an evening of intense work, they finally settle back down. This crack had been an ordeal to fight and to save all their food and the boats, but it also meant something that they had all hoped for: the breakup of the ice. Other signs of a breakup start to appear as well. They start to see Cape pigeons and terns, which are these kind of seabirds that only live near open water. The group also kills an 11-foot sea leopard, which brings in over 1,000 pounds of meat and a 2-week supply of blubber, which at this point they're using for both fuel and for food. The ice is breaking up, and now they have enough food to last. Everything's gonna be all right, right? Wrong. Unfortunately, the sea leopard isn't enough food, and the dog teams have to be shot and eaten as well. And yeah, we might look at this from our perspective and think, man, it's really sad that they had to kill the dogs, but you have to remember, it was never a part of the plan to put the dogs in the boats. For one, there's no chance they would have had enough room to fit all their supplies, all their men, and the dogs. And for two, have you ever seen the videos of dogs knocking their owners off of paddle boards in a flat lake? Imagine trying to row through an ocean with dozens of them. It's just not feasible. Cracks in the ice appear over the next couple of days to the point that they are camping on a piece of ice that is no more than 100 yards on each side. Pretty soon, there's not going to be enough ice left to camp on. April 7th, the men are gathered around, having breakfast, enjoying themselves. At one point, someone strikes a match so everyone can light their pipe or a cigarette. It's a good time when suddenly, in a booming voice, Shackleton orders, "Strike the tents and clear the boats." In a couple minutes of controlled chaos, everybody tears down their tents and they're throwing everything into the boats and pushing them towards the edge of the floe when... crack. The floe splits again, separating the crew from one of the boats and a ton of provisions. People go over and they pull the next boat across and throw over the provisions, and pretty soon they are on a piece of ice no bigger than 50 yards across. And while all this is going on, Green is passing out hot powdered milk and soup, just cooking in the chaos. Shackleton is now standing there with 1,000 different thoughts racing in his head. The ice is open now, but how long will it last? How long can we sit here on this tiny island of ice? If we go now, there's no chance of getting back onto the ice. Will we be able to navigate through the ice without being crushed? Is cereal a soup? Finally, in a quiet voice, he cuts through all the questions in his head. Launch the boats. In an instant, everything goes back into controlled chaos. Green the cook puts his stove up and starts loading it into a boat. Other groups are tying up the remainder of the food rations into canvas bags, while others still are taking the boats off of their sledges and putting the rest of the supplies into them. And finally, at 1:30 in the afternoon, all the boat crews load up into the boats and with the biggest poles they can muster, launch into the water. They notice immediately that this is going to be way more difficult than they thought. You have to remember that this is not rowing a boat in a flat lake. This is rowing in the ocean with waves constantly going up and down. And not only the waves, but these giant chunks of ice are in the way. They're smashing up against the boat, knocking it in multiple different directions, and the oars are getting hung up on the ice, making it more difficult to row, but also keeping everybody out of sync, because if one person has no ice and one person does, they have to row harder, which messes up the timing. So the going is extremely slow, but they eventually start making progress, and within an hour, they are a mile from camp, and the ice finally starts to loosen up. At this point in time, Shackleton and his crew are sailing at the northeast part of this area here, known as the Bransfield Strait. And to get a better understanding of what this region is like, I'm going to be referring to the U.S. Navy's sailing instructions for this region, which state, the charting of the waters in this vicinity are inadequate. Well, that's not helpful. Of the information that we have on this region, none of it bodes very well for Shackleton and his crew. For one, there is a phenomenon here known as cross sea, which is essentially where the current is flowing in the opposite direction that the wind is blowing, and this phenomenon is extremely unsettling to look at from land. I can't imagine sailing into it. This, paired with the fact that the waves in this sea reach anywhere from 6 to 10 feet high, they're fighting gale force winds and constant heavy snow, and the fact that the sky is only clear maybe 10% of the time, none of this paints a very good picture, but it is right into the mouth of this storm that Shackleton and his men are sailing. After traveling 7 miles from camp, they find a patch of ice that seems sturdy enough to camp on, and after hauling the boats up onto the ice, setting up the stove for dinner, and estimating their position, everybody turns in absolutely exhausted. Just before midnight, however, Shackleton wakes up and gets dressed, unable to shake an uneasy feeling that something is going to happen. As he walks outside, he realizes that the swells, or large, slow waves, have increased and are really smashing into the ice floe that they're on. Suddenly, he hears a loud thud as the floe splits directly between his feet and directly under one of the tents that has his sleeping men inside. Immediately after cracking, the two pieces of ice draw apart and the tent collapses, and then he hears a splash. The men inside the tent all scramble out and they realize that someone is missing. Shackleton rushes forward and he rips the canvas tent out of the way, and he looks down and he sees, wriggling in the water, a man inside of a sleeping bag. Shackleton immediately plunges his hand into the freezing water and, in a pure display of strength, rips the man and the sleeping bag out of the water. Not a moment later, the two pieces of ice crash back together. Alright, now we've got this guy safe, but we don't have time to worry about that because the crack is opening up again, separating one of the boats and the man sleeping in it from the rest of the crew. Again, Shackleton jumps into action. He takes a piece of rope and jumps across the gap and has men on both sides pulling as hard as they can, effectively pulling the blocks of ice together so that the other men can pull and move the items across. And they start moving things, and then the men start crossing as well, but by the time all the items and the men have crossed and Shackleton's the only one left on that side, the gap is too wide for him to cross. By the time everyone else is across, the gap is too wide and he stands as the lone man on a block of ice, drifting away into the darkness, and within a minute, he disappears completely. It is now pitch black and deafeningly quiet. The men are left there to deal with the fact that they just saw their captain for the last time, and nobody says a word, just silence and the waves. And this silence goes on for what feels like an eternity, when suddenly they hear Shackleton's voice yelling to launch a boat. Without hesitation, Frank Wild and half a dozen men pile into the Stancomb Willis and they launch the boat, and they start rowing in the direction of Shackleton's voice, and they're rowing and they're rowing, and they can't find him and they can't find him. All they can do is hear him in the waves. And then they finally see his outline in the darkness, and they row up to him, and he jumps inside the boat like some kind of Arctic pirate, and they head back to camp. All right, now that our leader has done a power slide back into a boat, we can attend to the guy who fell in the water, and Shackleton orders that everyone is to take turns walking him around the camp until his clothes dry. The entire time that he's doing this sailor doesn't complain about the cold once. He does, however, complain for hours about the fact that he lost his tobacco when he fell in the water. After an extremely long and eventful night, it's finally time for breakfast and to start sailing again. And once again, it's not an easy time. They run into the same problems they had earlier with the ice, but eventually make it out to open sea. And they finally make it to truly open water for the first time in over a year, and it's just as difficult. See, open water means undisturbed waves. Undisturbed waves means sea spray and wind, which is really cold in Antarctica. Who would have guessed? This, however, doesn't really discourage the men because this is what they wanted. They wanted the adventure, and also they can't be more than 25 miles from land. This is awesome. However, due to the wind and the location of the ice, a change in plans has to be made. They currently believe that their position is 25 miles south-southwest of Clarence Island here. However, due to most of the open water being to the west, they decide that it's going to be best for them to sail towards King George Island here. This is also a better idea for them because it's a less remote island, and they're also hoping that once they land on King George Island, they can sort of just island hop their way down this chain of islands here until they reach what is known as Deception Island here. The reason that they want to go to Deception Island is, one, that it is more frequently visited by whalers in the region. It's also believed that there is a cache of food that was left there for stowaways specifically. The third reason being that there is a small chapel that exists on the island that was built by the whalers. Shackleton believes they could tear it down and use it to make a boat big enough for the entire crew to fit in. So the plan is set, and they start heading in that direction. And after about a day of sailing, the sky finally clears up enough for Worsley to attempt and get a location. As he does this, something seems wrong. A puzzled look comes over his face, and he's not really quite sure what to do, so he runs the numbers multiple times, and after doing so, he pulls his boat alongside Shackleton's and shares his discovery. And what he has discovered is how wrong his original estimates were. Rather than being 80 miles northeast of King George Island, which was about here, they were actually 120 miles directly east, about here, which means that they are now 20 miles further away from land than when they left camp 3 days ago. This is obviously not great news. They have been rowing and camping on icebergs and rowing again for 3 days straight and have made negative progress. But they kind of just have to roll with it, so they change their plans again. This time they're going to shoot for what is called Hope Bay, on the eastern tip of the Palmer Peninsula here. And just as they leave to start heading in that direction, the wind flips and starts blowing northwest. So, for the fourth time, they change their plans again. Only this time, it's going to be the original plan. Elephant Island, which is now just shy of 100 miles away. After making this decision, Shackleton says that every man is allowed to eat however much he wants. He did this because he thinks that it will help them fight off not only the cold, but the lack of sleep they'd had. However, this isn't very enticing for a lot of the men because they are currently suffering from seasickness. One of them, however, may just be pretending to have seasickness, and he pisses everybody off. Orderly's the storekeeper. The entire time since they got in the boats, he has done nothing but been a pain to everyone. Not only is he complaining of seasickness, which he may or may not have, he's also complaining about working the entire time. He's trying so hard to get out of work that he is purposefully rowing out of sync with the other rowers so that he then smashes the hands of the rower behind him. Thus, that guy complains to Worsley, who then has Orderly's relieved. This is shamming on a level that even the E4 Mafia would not sink to, and they'll do almost anything to take a nap, but I'm pretty sure they would put a hit out on this guy. So everyone's tired of him getting out of work for the last couple days, so when Shackleton orders that they can eat however much they want, they make sure to make the most disgusting eating sounds and make sure that he sees them so that if he actually is seasick, it will make him sicker. Shortly after this, they break out into completely open ocean, and it is just a continued struggle against the wind and the waves. The swells that had previously been kind of subdued by the ice are now hitting them in full force, and every single swell that they row up is like rowing up a giant hill of water in a boat, and they do this over and over and over again. Finally, as night approaches, they know that they need to get some rest, so it is decided that they are going to tie all of the boats together and rig up what is known as a sea anchor, which is basically a giant underwater parachute that is designed to keep the boats from floating too far in the open water. So they rig one of these up for the night with what supplies they have, and they prepare for the long night ahead of them, and what a night it is. Not only does the wind pick up significantly and the temperature drop well below 8 below zero, but the water that is being tossed over the side of the boat is almost immediately freezing, covering the men and everything in the boat. And as the night drags on, it gets colder and colder and darker and darker. And the men try to sleep and keep from freezing to death, but nobody is certain that they're going to survive. Surely the sun will rise, and as it does, the wind begins to change to a gentle breeze, and as the sun breaks the horizon, there, just 30 miles away, they see it, Elephant Island. At this point, even Orderly's is getting motivated, and he takes buckets from inside the boat and starts bailing out water from inside. Worsley, the captain of the Dudley Docker, spends the entire day trying to find a way to make it to land, but each time they try, something prevents them from making it, and they soon realize they're gonna have to spend another night in the boats. That night, Shackleton is talking to Percy Blackborough, who informs him that the frostbite in his feet has gotten to the point where his feet are completely numb, and Shackleton tries to cheer him up by promising him that he'll be the first person to ever step foot on Elephant Island. And the next morning, they look for and they find a place where they can try to land, and they go for it. And as they finally make it to shore, Shackleton remembers his promise from the night before and basically throws Blackborough off the side of the boat, forgetting that he cannot stand or feel his feet or walk, so Blackborough just sits in the water with the waves crashing into him. Shackleton had been so excited to make it to land and keep his promise that he'd forgotten the reason he made the promise in the first place, and he has two other men drag Percy onto shore. The other two boats make it ashore and very quickly are emptied of both men and supplies. And after all the work is done, the men are just kind of aimlessly wandering around, some of them picking up stones, others just laying on the rocks and breathing. But regardless of all these strange behaviors, one thing is for certain: they are all ecstatic. For the first time in 497 days, they are on land. So we've made it to the island and are safe on land. First order of business, drink some hot milk. Now that that's done, second order of business is get in the boats and move again. Wait, what? Yeah, the position that they originally landed in ended up being less ideal than they had thought, so they ended up getting back in the boats and moving before they set up camp in a more ideal location. They get camp set up and deal with a short blizzard. Shackleton finally makes an announcement. He has decided that himself and 5 other crew members are going to get in the James Caird and sail for South Georgia Island to try and get help. If you remember, South Georgia Island is the last place that they had their port of call before heading into the Weddell Sea, and there's a whaling station with people who know Shackleton and his crew quite well. Now, if you're looking at this map and you understand that they're currently here at Elephant Island, You might ask yourself, why would they not sail to Cape Horn, 500 miles northwest, or the Falkland Islands, 550 miles straight north? Why would they sail 880 miles here to South Georgia? Well, it is because of this body of water right here. This is what's known as the Drake Passage, the deadliest stretch of ocean on the planet. The swells in this region of the ocean have been recorded as reaching almost a mile long from crest to crest, with 80 to 90 foot high waves, which is scary on its own, but I believe it's what causes this that is even more terrifying. If you look at the ocean around Antarctica, it is different than every other ocean for one simple reason: there is no landmass that gets in the way. Every other ocean in the world eventually runs into a continent, and that causes the waves there to dissipate and stops the wind as well. But if you look at the shape of Antarctica, there isn't anything. The wind and the waves there can just go in a giant circle that feeds back into itself, that creates these massive waves and these howling winds. Also pair this with the fact that the Drake Passage acts as a sort of choke point for those. It's no wonder that you have records of the wind going 200 miles an hour. But you have to remember, it's all going east. And it's for that reason that Shackleton decides to ride the waves to South Georgia. So another note on how terrifying the Drake Passage is: Charles Darwin visited Cape Horn in 1883 and for the first time saw the waters of the Drake Passage and was quoted as saying, "The sight is enough to make a landsman dream for a week about death, peril, and shipwreck." Comforting. Shackleton knows all of this, and yet he is daring to cross the passage in a 22-foot wooden boat. Shackleton has a plan. Now he has to select his crew of 5 for the journey, and his first pick obviously is Worsley. He needs a navigator, and Worsley just navigated them to Elephant Island. This next trip is obviously going to be harder, but there's nobody that Shackleton trusts more at this point with navigation. He then picks Tom Crean and Travis McCarthy because they're both very hard workers and are well liked. And the other two he picks for the exact opposite reason. Harry McNeish and Jack Vincent had the potential of causing discontent amongst the crew, and Shackleton knew that if that happened while they were trying to survive on this island, it was going to have catastrophic consequences. So he takes them with him so he can keep an eye on them. Immediately after Shackleton announces this, work starts on preparing the James Caird for the journey. All the extra planks that had been added to the Dudley Docker were removed and used to create a sort of decking to help enclose the boat, and they created ballasts using canvas sacks and shale from the island to help balance the new and improved boat. While all this was going on, the Dudley Docker was actually flipped upside down to create a makeshift sort of shelter for the rest of the crew that was going to be staying, and they got to work waterproofing it. As the preparations for the trip continue, Shackleton actually writes several letters. The first gives all responsibility for the photos and the video footage that was captured on the expedition to Frank Wild. The second also gives Wild complete command over the crew and instructs him to do whatever he can to save the crew should Shackleton not survive the journey, which there's a really strong possibility of. Like, although everybody's really hopeful, they know that this trip is a long shot. After a couple days of preparations, the time has come. The crews get everything loaded up in the boats, and soon they say their goodbyes and launch. Everyone is hopeful, but there is an undertone of suspense. The idea that this could be the last time they ever see each other is on everybody's mind, but regardless, as the James Caird and her tiny crew row out into the ocean, the crew on the beach shouts, "Good luck, boss." Shackleton spins around and waves goodbye to the men, and soon the boat rows out of sight, leaving them all to wait. Almost immediately, work gets started on creating a better shelter. The men build this little foundation of rocks that they then flip the other boat and set it on top of, and pretty soon they have a little makeshift hut. They also discover that they can create candles using blubber oil and surgical bandages to light their little building. And although it certainly isn't much, for men that have been living in canvas tents on melting ice, this is a luxury. After this, they just start working to survive. They're collecting water, they're killing penguins for food. At one point, they take an oar and use it to make a flagpole. And although these tasks make up the bulk of their time, when they're not doing this, they're thinking of rescue. And at one point, they have a discussion about how tired they are of meat. This leads them to eventually taking a poll of all the foods that everybody wants to have when they get back home, which is the most guy in the military thing. They're listing things off like cake and pudding and sweet dumplings. It's the most boot camp graduate discussion. Funnily enough, Blackborough just wanted a piece of bread and butter. Speaking of Blackborough, Blackborough, the time eventually comes where something has to be done about his feet. If you'll remember, his feet have been frostbitten since they first landed on this island back in April. By this point, it's now June. The surgeons, McElroy and Macklin, set up a little makeshift surgeon's table and do the best they can to sterilize their instruments and get to work. And it's kind of a shoddy operation. They have to use chloroform to knock Blackborough out, and they end up removing all of his toes up to the ball joint. And in total, the surgery takes about 55 minutes. And as soon as Blackborough wakes up, he cheerfully asks them for a cigarette. About a week after the surgery, the crew realizes that it is Midwinter's Day, and they decide to have a party just like they did a year prior on their ship. They have a hearty breakfast, and just like before, they're telling stories and they're reciting poems, and even Hussey plays his banjo. But their celebration soon turns to mourning as the greatest tragedy of the entire trip strikes. This is worse than losing the ship and running out of rations, or even the potential that the boss is dead. They ran out of tobacco. In all seriousness, though, this is actually a real problem because not only is it demoralizing for the men, there's a pretty high likelihood that they're going to go through some kind of withdrawal period where their irritability and their appetites are both going to go up, which could cause a lot of other issues. But if there's anything these men have learned since being under Shackleton's command, it's endurance and adaptability. Real quick, I gotta talk about some of the men's gear. Now, one of the most important pieces of gear that the men have with them right now are their boots. They're specifically designed for Antarctic exploration, and they are filled with an insulation called sennegrass. Sennegrass is a kind of plant fiber that absorbs moisture and helps insulate from the cold. And these men are so desperate for a smoke that they start ripping the sennegrass insulation out of their boots and start smoking it. And like, don't get me wrong, I love tobacco. I mean, obviously. But I have never been so desperate to think, you know what would be a good replacement? My boot insulation. On the other hand, I guess, I'd be a little stressed if I was in this kind of situation too, so who knows, maybe I would. After the tobacco runs out, things just become more and more worn down. They run out of more of the rations, including the powdered milk, and as the monotony of the days continue to drag, they finally realize that it's now August 1st, the 2-year anniversary of them sailing from London. And by the time the end of August rolls around, they all come to a realization that they were trying to avoid. They are going to have to spend the winter on the island. Now, we have to rewind back to April 24th. Just after 2 p.m., the James Caird and her crew of 6 men lose sight of Elephant Island and are sailing into ice. They navigate through the really loose ice pack very easily, and within a few more hours, they are completely back out in open water. And after they get out of the ice and into open water, there's nothing left to do but sail and hope that they can make it to the small island of South Georgia, 870 miles away. It's this fact, the dauntingness of this task, that finally starts to weigh on Shackleton. At one point during the journey, it's just a quiet evening with waves lapping against the boat. Worsley is manning the tiller, and Shackleton starts rolling cigarettes for the two of them, and he confides in Worsley that it was extremely difficult for him to make the decision for this last-ditch effort to make it to South Georgia. He tells him that he feels that the responsibility for this expedition is squarely on his shoulders, and that he's just starting to feel the weight. We don't know exactly how this conversation ends, but it's essentially summed up that Shackleton tells Worsley that for the first time, he feels completely out of his element. Regardless, he has to continue. These are his men, and it's his responsibility, and he's going to continue to do whatever it takes in order to save them. 6 days goes by of these men just constantly fighting the ocean. The Drake Passage is throwing everything that it can at these men in their tiny boat, but they are still working as hard as they can. And after the 6th day, the sun finally shows the sky has opened up enough for Worsley to get a reading, and what he finds is they have traveled 240 miles and are nearly a third of the way to their destination. This is obviously great news and motivation for the men, who continue to work even harder to make further progress. But almost as if the ocean was aware of their progress, it decides to fight them even harder. The waves that they've been fighting for 6 days increase in their violence, and the wind picks up to nearly 70 miles an hour. It's as if the ocean is trying even harder to sink them. Although it's tough going, it doesn't really work, and they continue to make progress. But again, it's almost as if Poseidon, not wanting to be outdone by 6 men in a tiny wooden boat, tries another trick and freezes. Not just a little, it freezes so bad, in fact, that the sails on the boat that have been whipping in the wind of 70 miles an hour freeze solid and are not moving. The oars that they're using to row the boat become so bogged down by ice that it not only weighs the boat down, but it makes it almost impossible to move them. They start beating on the sail to chip the ice off so that they can actually take the sail down, and they're chunking it off of the sides of the boat, and they actually end up ditching a pair of their oars that are too weighed down by the ice. And finally, they're able to kind of control the boat again. However, this doesn't really help them because by the time all of this gets done, it's nighttime and they're not really able to do anything but hunker down and wait for what they believe is going to be a very long night. And that's exactly what they get. They spend all night shivering and doing their best to stay awake on watch and try to get as much sleep as they can, but sleeping's not much better than getting awake. At this point, the sleeping bags that they have with them are starting to fall apart. The reindeer hair that they used to insulate their sleeping bags was now everywhere. It completely coated the men, it was in their food, it was blocking up the pump to get water out. It's just a mess. Although there is one positive thing that does happen that night. The boat finally starts to move less violently in the ocean, and it starts to actually match the pitch of the waves, and they think maybe they're finally out of the Drake Passage and the seas are starting to calm down. They're not. What actually had happened was the boat is so weighed down by nearly 6 inches of ice covering every surface that it's not able to really bob with the waves or move in the kind of violent way that it would because it's sitting so far down in the water. When Shackleton gets up in the morning, he notices this and immediately goes to work. He takes a small little hatchet and crawls out to the front of the boat and starts chipping the ice away. The entire time, waves and wind are crashing on him, freezing him and making him fatigued, so much so that he's only able to work for 5 minutes before he has to trade off with another member of the crew. The crew does this over and over again, even lighting the stove inside the boat so that it can get warm enough inside that they're able to pump the water out. And after about an hour of rigorous work, the boat is mostly ice-free. However, the afternoon doesn't really prove to be much better. It is so cold that the ice immediately starts to form again, and they have to go back to work, removing it once again. They continue on this pattern for several days, and then on May 3rd, the weather gets nice enough that they're able to take a reading to figure out their position. What they discover is they are now 403 miles away from South Georgia Island, over halfway through their journey, and what a journey it has been. Not only have they fought everything that I've mentioned with the weather and the waves, but again, the sleeping bags that they're in are falling apart and they're actually starting to rot. Like, they smell inside the boat. They have these boils on their skin from not only the salt water that they've been fighting, but also frostbite from the cold. Their joints are just stiff from being soaking wet and cold for so long. And yet, they're in a pretty good mood. And honestly, I get it. If my goal was to cross the most dangerous stretch of ocean on the planet, and I was not only alive, but actively making progress, I'd be pretty happy too. After a few more days of travel, they decide that they're gonna actually have the sails up at night and have somebody stand on watch. One night, it's Shackleton's turn at the watch, and he sees a break in the clouds. They've had several days of just terrible weather, and they're unable to get a reading, so excitedly, he wakes up everybody else so that they can get the reading, and as he does this, he starts to hear this low rumble and hissing sound. That rift in the sky was actually not a break in the weather, but was the top of a rogue wave that is bearing down right on them. And as it comes towards them, Shackleton screams for everybody to get down and hold on because he knows that there's no way out of this and they're just going to have to ride it out. As the wave slams into the boat, it actually picks the boat up into the air for a moment and Shackleton is almost swept off the side. The water from the wave pours in and almost completely fills the inside of the boat. So the other men immediately get to work bailing out water while Shackleton keeps his eyes open for another rogue wave, but it never comes. And after 2 hours of work, the boat is finally emptied. The next morning is not much easier than the night before. The wind is now blowing 50 knots in the opposite direction, and they have no choice but to just hunker down and fight against it. And after several hours of fighting, Worsley's able to get a reading, and what he discovers only serves to motivate them to fight harder, because they are now within 90 miles of South Georgia. This is amazing news. They've only been in the water for 13 days and have traveled over 780 miles. Like, at this point, they have to make it. They basically have plot armor. Unfortunately, the ocean does not really care about their plot armor, and it gets so rough that they have to take the sail down and basically just float and hope that they don't lose progress. While they're waiting, floating against this harsh sea, a small bird starts trying to land on the boat, and it's making this extremely annoying noise, and it keeps trying to land, and it keeps making this noise, and it keeps trying to land, and it keeps making this noise, and finally, Shackleton snaps, and he starts cursing and swinging his arms at this bird. He has come too far to be mocked by a bird. This is his tipping point. After this outburst, Shackleton realizes what a bad example this set for his men, and he sits down, completely disheveled at losing his temper. But there's no time to worry about that, because as he sits down, Tom Crean hands him a cup of water to taste. He takes a drink and immediately tastes salt water, meaning that their water supply has been tainted. Since they left Elephant Island, they've actually had 2 big casks of fresh water with them. When they first left Elephant Island, one of the casks had become untied from the ship that was bringing it out and floated around for some time, and they now realize this must have caused seawater to seep into the cask, thus tainting their clean drinking water. After this, they start working as hard as possible against the wind and the waves to make as much headway as possible, and they continue to work through the night and into the next morning, and just after noon, through a large volume of fog, they think they see it. A cliff just barely poking out of the fog. They take out their navigation charts to verify what they're seeing, and sure enough, directly ahead of them through the fog is a small piece of land called Cape Demidov, which means they are only 16 miles away from their original goal. Which also means that Worsley's navigation through the Drake Passage, again, the most treacherous ocean on the planet, was only off by 1 degree. Again, cannot overstate how incredible this was to do in a 22-foot wooden boat. After another day and night of struggling to get the boat on land, they finally pull onto the island a little after 4 p.m. on May 10th. They are now standing on the island that they left 522 days ago when they left the Stromness whaling station. Only one problem: they're on the opposite side of the island. So work gets started on setting up a bit of a camp for the men that are going to be left behind and getting the James Caird out of the water. The last thing that they wanted was for the 3 men going overland to not make it and the rest be left without a boat. After this, McNeish starts preparing the boots for the men that are going to be hiking over the mountain. He takes 2-inch screws from the James Caird and punctures them through the soles of the boots to create sort of crampons to grip the ice as they climb. And then they pack up all the gear that they're going to be taking with them, which includes 3 days' rations each, a filled Primus stove and enough fuel to cook the meals, a small cooking pot, 2 compasses, 1 pair of binoculars, 50 feet of rope, and a carpenter's adze to be used as an ice axe. The night of May 18th, Shackleton writes a letter similar to the one that he left for Frank Wild, but to McNeish, relinquishing command to him. The letter included instructions for survival and eventual escape should Shackleton himself not make it, but it does end with hope, stating, "I trust to have you relieved in a few days. Yours faithfully, E.H. Shackleton." The next morning at 3 a.m., and after a sleepless night for himself, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean leave camp to start the final push of the journey. By sunrise, they estimate that they've covered nearly 5 miles, and they see what appears to be a frozen lake. This is awesome news because it means rather than walking up or downhill like they have been, they can just walk flat across the surface of the lake. By 7 a.m., they realize that this is not in fact a frozen lake, but an open bay into the ocean. They were walking towards an open bay on the north side of the island, and at this point they have covered nearly 7 miles, but in an extremely narrow part of the island. And because they had been walking downhill, they were further north than they had wanted to be, so this means that they now have to retrace their steps back uphill and then turn to go east. And which, I mean, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? Why don't they just go to the bay and then skirt the outside of the island until they make it to the whaling station? That is partially due to the fact that a lot of the shores in South Georgia are just straight drop cliffs. And it's also because it's so jagged and filled with these tiny little inlets and bays. If they were to actually go across the entire outskirts of the island, it would more than double their journey, and that is just not feasible with the equipment and food that they have. So back up the hill they head, and after 2 hours of hiking, they finally make it to where they need to be to turn east. Another thing you might be thinking to yourself is, why didn't they know where they were? Well, remember how I said that nobody had ever crossed South Georgia Island before? Well, that means that nobody had charted the interior of the island, and even some of the exterior was not charted, which means that the map that they were using is basically like a video game map where everything that's unexplored is gray. So they've made it back to where they were when they made the wrong turn, and they start heading east, and pretty soon they see a range of 4 mountains, each reaching about 5,000 feet in the air, and Worsley estimates that their best path is going to be between 2 mountains on the north side. They make their way to the summit between those 2 mountains, and it's a dud. On the other side of the mountain, they see basically 2 options. They see a giant glacier that is falling off into the ocean, and a giant crevice on the other side. So neither of those options sound very good, so yet again, they turn around and head back down. After retracing their steps again, they decide to make their way between mountains 2 and 3, and they have to climb this giant ice shelf between the 2 mountains, which is an extremely difficult task. They're cutting steps into the ice with their adze, which is very laborious and takes a long time, but they eventually make it to the summit of this one, and they realize that the way down is just as steep and is going to be just as difficult because they're going to have to continue to cut steps into it, only this time headed down. However, we have a bigger problem. It is now after 4 p.m., which means that the sun is starting to go down and it is going to be dark soon, and with dark comes cold. They estimate that they're 5,000 feet above sea level, meaning it will reach well below zero when the sun disappears, and they will freeze to death. There is no possible way that they survive that elevation and that temperature without shelter. They immediately get to work cutting steps into the other side of this ice shelf, and pretty soon Shackleton realizes that it's not fast enough. He looks at the ice slope that he's cutting these steps into, and after thinking for a minute, he starts cutting a platform into the ice that all of them can stand on, and he calls the others down, and once they get to him, he tells them his plan. They slide down. Worsley and Crean are absolutely mortified by this suggestion. Crean asks, like, what happens if we hit a rock? Shackleton responds, can we stay here? Worsley asks, well, what if there's another crevasse and it doesn't level off? And again, Shackleton at this point is getting annoyed, and he asks again, can we stay here? The answer is obviously no. If they stay here, they're going to freeze to death, and they are going to leave the men on the other side of the island and those on Elephant Island to a slow death of starvation or freezing to death. They take the rope, which has been tied around each of them to keep them from getting separated, and they coil it down on the ground. Shackleton then sits down front. Worsley sits behind him and locks his legs around Shackleton's waist and grabs his upper body with his arms, and then Crean does the same to him. Kind of like when you go sledding with your siblings, only there's no sled. Once the men are ready on their makeshift sled, they push off the platform into the unknown. Immediately, the wind is screaming in their ears and the cold is biting their face. The snow that gets kicked up goes rushing by them as the pressure builds in their ears as they go further and further down. They start to scream because the pressure has gotten so intense that it forces all the air out of their lungs, and they go faster and faster and faster until the three men crash into a soft snowbank that covers them in snow, and they just lay on the ground laughing. In just under a minute, they estimate they dropped over 2,000 feet in elevation. But they are now safe thanks to the power of thinking outside the box, the willingness to follow, and sheer dumb luck. After taking a second to have a hot meal and a moment to rest, they continue their journey east. And after several hours of marching and aided by the full moon that is rising in front of them, they see Mutton Island, a small landmass in Stromness Bay. So they continue downhill, but after several hours, they notice that there are crevices on their left and their right, which would indicate that they were on a glacier, but there are no glaciers in Stromness Bay, meaning that once again, they're in the wrong place, and once again, they have to turn around and hike back uphill. At this point, they are tired, cold, and pissed, and they want to take a nap. So they find a little spot behind a rock outcropping and sit down, and Crean and Worsley fall asleep immediately. Shackleton soon finds himself nodding off, and just as he's about to close his eyes, he jerks himself awake. He had spent enough time in the Antarctic to know that this was a bad sign, and that if he fell asleep, they would all freeze to death. So after 5 minutes, he wakes up the others, but he tells them that they've slept for half an hour, and they continue on. Again, this just showcases the dedication that Shackleton has towards his men, fighting off everything in his own body that is telling him to sleep, selflessly fighting his desire to rest because he knows what it will lead to. So they continue their hike, now in the correct direction, and as dawn breaks, they hear it. Ever so faintly, they hear what they believe to be a steam whistle. They aren't actually sure that that's what they hear, but it's enough to catch their attention, and they know that the steam whistle at the Stromness whaling station blows at 6:30 to wake everyone up, and at 7 a.m. to call them to work. So they sit there and they wait, and they count down the minutes and then the seconds. 3, 2, 1. There, clear as day, they hear the steam whistle of the Stromness whaling station, the first sounds of civilization that they have heard since December 1914. They continue their way down, and after taking several hours to get off the edge of the ice floe they were on, at 1:30 p.m., they crest a ridge, and below them they see the Stromness whaling station. They continue to make their way down to the station, and as they reach the outskirts, a couple of young boys see them and are terrified by the sight of these men, so they go screaming towards the docks, and Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean follow them, and they meet the station foreman, who then takes them to the home of the station manager, Thorolf Sorrel, one of the last men to see them nearly 2 years ago. And with that, our story has come full circle, but it isn't over. After meeting with Sorrel, the three men are treated to their first bath in years, as well as a fresh haircut and shave, and some new pairs of clothes. After this, Worsley then boards a whaling vessel and sails around South Georgia to pick up the other three men and the James Caird left at their camp. Meanwhile, Shackleton has already started to work trying to figure out how they're going to save everybody else that's still trapped on Elephant Island, and he would spend the next 3.5 months trying to recover the rest of his men, but each time he was met by a different setback, whether it was the ship that he had couldn't make it, or the weather was bad, or he ran into ice. Each time, it takes a visible toll on him. Worsley said he had never seen Shackleton so on edge. Finally, after some pleading with the Chilean government, Shackleton is allowed the use of a seagoing tugboat called the Yelko in order to make one final last-ditch effort to save the men before winter. They leave for Elephant Island on August 25th, and on August 30th, they reach their destination. At 1:10 p.m., the boat sees the camp. As it pulls closer, the crew of the boat can see men coming out of this ramshackle hut, some of them breaking through the sides because going through the door is taking too long. Pretty soon, the ship lowers a smaller boat for going ashore, and the last man to get on the boat, worn, anxious, and terrified of what he might find, Ernest Shackleton. Pretty soon, the boat gets close enough that it can communicate with the people on shore, and Shackleton has just one question: "Are you all right?" And the person on shore responds, "All well." Worsley is believed to have said, "It was as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders in an instant." Shackleton can now rest, knowing that he saved every single one of his men. Normally, this is where the story would end. It would tell you that everybody returned victorious and that they had survived one of the greatest ordeals in history, which is true, but unfortunately, history got in the way. Unfortunately for the crew, the greatest honor and recognition and welcome back to civilization would actually take place in Chile, where they were greeted by a large crowd and then begin the process of being sent back to Britain. And their arrival in Britain, unfortunately, would basically barely be noticed, and many of them would immediately sign up for military service and sent to war. Two of the members of the party, Tim McCarthy and Alfred Sheatham, would actually later be killed in action. Frank Hurley's images and videos would be developed and used for both a film and in lecture tours around the United States. Hurley himself would go on to become a wartime photographer in both World War I and World War II, again living up to the adage of nobody's gonna believe that this happened unless I have some dope pictures of it. Shackleton would do what he could to help with the war effort, even joining the British Army, but once the war was over, he started making plans for another expedition. It seems he was living up to words that his wife had told him before the Endurance expedition: "You cannot keep an eagle caged." Upon Shackleton's return from London, he would actually write the book that he had promised, and that book is called South. It's a very detailed description of the expedition and the journey that they took, and it's a very excellent read as far as the details go. It's not as narratively structured as some other books that exist about it, but it is a good read if you're looking for those kind of extreme details. When thinking about the struggles of the journey, he wrote this: "When I look back at those days, I have no doubt that Providence guided us, not only across those snowfields, but across the storm-strewn sea that separated Elephant Island from our landing place on South Georgia. I know that during that long, racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3. I said nothing to my companions to the point, but afterwards Worsley said to me, 'Boss, I had a curious feeling on the march that there was another person with us.' Crean confessed the same idea. One feels the dearth of human words, the roughness of mortal speech in trying to describe things intangible, but a record of our journeys would be incomplete without a reference to a subject so very near to our hearts." It seems that even in these dire situations, in these moments where he's having this anxiety and this worry about caring for the men and saving everybody on this expedition, it seems like the faith that had been rooted and caused him to tear out those verses of the Bible was with him all the way through the journey. And in a weird kind of historical juxtaposition, if you know the book of Daniel, there's a story about 3 men called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who are tossed into a fiery furnace for having faith in their God. And when they're tossed into the furnace, there's a 4th person there with them. And it seems like Shackleton, Crean, and Worsley in the opposite. They're in the cold and the ice and the snow, but through their faith in God, he walks with them. He's the 4th person on their journey. I just think that that's an incredible thing to show that his faith, their faith, that there was somebody guiding them, that there was somebody walking with them through, what we talked about. Like, this place is completely unknown, but God is walking with them. Through the valley of the shadow of death, they are walking, and God is walking with them. I just think that that's an incredible thing for these men to be in these dire situations, but letting their faith guide them. In 1921, Shackleton, along with Wild, Worsley, and several other members of the Endurance crew, left for the Antarctic on board the ship Quest. Their goal was to sail all the way around the Antarctic continent, mapping it the entire time. However, this goal would not be reached. While ported on South Georgia, Shackleton suffered a heart attack and died on January 5th, 1922, at the age of 48. And with him also died the heroic age of Antarctic expedition. He was buried on South Georgia Island, where his tombstone still stands as a monument to that age of exploration. This would be where the video would end. However, there is a small detail that I left out. I have spent a lot of time in this video talking about how incredible it was that Shackleton crossed the Drake Passage in this 22-foot boat. I'm saying this as somebody whose words might not have a lot of weight. I've never been to that area of the world, and I've certainly never sailed it, but fortunately, we do have the words of someone who did. On the night of May 22nd, 1916, the day that Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean arrived at the Stromness whaling station, a small ceremony was held. In the largest room that they could find, a large gathering of sailors, first mates, and captains all came together. The smell of tobacco smoke and rotting whale carcasses outside. 4 of the most senior captains came forward and explained how they had sailed the Antarctic Sea for over 40 years, and they wanted to shake the hands of the men who could sail from Elephant Island through the Drake Passage to South Georgia Island in a 22-foot boat. At this point, every single man in the room stands up, and one by one, they shake the hands of Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean. And although the men would receive many different awards and would hear different people boasting about how amazing their feat was, nothing would ever compare to this, which to me makes sense. The people back home have no idea what this place is really like. They don't understand the struggle and the hardship that this place creates and what it requires of you to survive. But these captains do. It is their admiration that adds to my belief that Ernest Shackleton is the greatest Antarctic explorer of all time. And with such a title like that, I should really list his accomplishments. He failed to reach the South Pole. He failed to cross the Antarctic continent. He failed to circumnavigate the continent. And he was the first to cross South Georgia, but only in desperation. So why would he be the best when his only real achievement was forced on him? For one, because he dared to do it in the first place. Most people I know can't handle it if it gets 60 degrees outside, and he voluntarily goes to one of the coldest places on the planet where he has to spend months in complete darkness eating seal fat and penguin meat. There's a quote somewhere about how all explorers are just standing on the shoulders of giants, and I believe that Shackleton is one of those giants. His plan to cross Antarctica was so daring that the next person to try it was in the 1950s, and the next person to cross South Georgia Island took the easier of 2 routes when Shackleton took the harder. But if all of that is not enough to convince you, then maybe this will. I believe that Shackleton is the greatest Antarctic explorer for one simple fact. The only person to ever die on an expedition that he led was himself. He gave up one of the greatest accomplishments in exploration, reaching the South Pole, because he knew that it would cost him the lives of his men, and he refused to do so. It's one thing to say that a prize is worth your ship and your crew, but it is a totally different thing. It is on a different level to say that no prize, no glory, no accomplishment is worth losing a crew member, and it is for that simple fact that I believe Shackleton is the best. I forgot to mention something. The Ross Sea Party, the party that was actually taking all the food rations down that were supposed to be set for the crossing of the continent, they did not fare nearly as well as Shackleton and his crew, and several of those members actually did end up dying. While they were part of a expedition that Shackleton was leading, I do not really count them as part of this claim that I make that nobody died under him, because they weren't under his direct command. Yeah, sure, they had the goal of going out and being a part of the expedition. That was it. How they did it and the day-to-day or month-to-month or even year-to-year in this case decisions were not made by him. He had no idea what was going on there, so he couldn't actually have an impact on how any of that happened. So I don't really count that, but I felt like it was something that I needed to bring up. I also felt that it was important to mention that once they got back to Britain, Shackleton actually had to reprimand several of the members of the crew for failing to perform duties as was assigned or to the expectations of the expedition, similar to what had to happen with him when he was on the expedition with Scott. So we know what happened to Shackleton and his crew, but what of the Endurance itself? was she ever recovered from the depths of the sea. In early 22, a group of researchers under the expedition name Endurance 22 went searching for the ship in the Weddell Sea using an unmanned underwater vehicle. And on March 5th, 2022, 100 years and 2 months after Shackleton's death, and for the first time in 107 years, the Endurance would be seen by human eyes. She was discovered at almost the exact coordinates that Frank Worsley said she had sank, and she now sits 10,000 feet below the waves and the ice of the Weddell Sea, and is now under international protection as a historic monument to the age of Antarctic exploration. And that is the best way I know how to conclude the story of the HMS Endurance, her crew, and her captain, the greatest Antarctic explorer of all time, Ernest Shackleton. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope that I was able to do this story justice. I believe that this is a story that does not get the traction and the attention by people that it deserves, and I'm sure that a lot of that has to do with the fact that World War I was going on at the exact same time. I get it. I don't know why you would care about potentially losing 27 men on an expedition when you're potentially losing tens of thousands a day in war. I hate that that covered it up at the time, and still a ton of people don't know about it today. And hopefully I was able to fix that today and do it justice. I also hate that I constantly, especially around Christmas time, because it's when it took place, I see like videos of the Christmas truce, that time where a bunch of soldiers from both sides of World War I came together in the middle of the battlefield and they played soccer and exchanged gifts, and how it's this heartwarming story about the humanity coming out in the midst of war. And I'm like, yeah, like that would be fine if that's how the war ended. But that happened in December of 1914, and the war lasted nearly another 4 years. The people who participated in these truces went back to killing each other like a day later. But no, we have to hear about this story all the time, not the story of 27 men trapped inside a ship and celebrating Christmas as they're trying to accomplish this feat that humanity had not done, going into a place where humans are not supposed to go and surviving anyway, and not just surviving, actually making an accomplishment. I'm so tired of hearing these stories, and it's like, oh, well, why do people not know about it? Oh, because of World War I, or because of World War II, or because of how we teach those things. And I don't know, I'm getting frustrated. I hope that you really enjoyed this video. I hope that I can see you in other videos as I continue to tell more stories about these amazing people throughout history and the stories that they have. Yeah, I'm really fired up about the Christmas truce thing. There's probably people out there who are like, well, I mean, it's a big waste of time. Like, why would you go down to the Antarctic? There's nothing there worth value. And I'm like, okay, you know what? Like, fair point. I mean, I feel the same way about space exploration, but like, that's a different video for a different time. But I feel like you could argue that about most anything that humans do. So I don't really think that that's a fair point. If you guys want to see, like, learn more about this expedition or anything, they actually made a documentary about the Endurance 22 expedition. It's on National Geographic. You can go watch that, or you can get the book that helped me make this video the most, which is Endurance by Alfred Lansing. There is a ton of information in this book that I did not go over. It is an extremely good read. It just makes the story extremely compelling, and I'm thankful that I was able to read it and learn more that I didn't know. All right, anyway, I'm gonna go smoke my pipe and pretend I'm back on the ocean. The end. I am going to have to tell a story about American sailors next, because I talked up the British so much in this video, and as an American, I cannot have that.